The thing about Canada is just a phenomenal place in a number of ways, but as it relates to deep tech, Canada has some of the top research institutions in the world, and we produce great talent. And the United States and others, but in particular the United States, use us as a source for recruiting talent. So I'm an example of that.
24/7. Steven. 24/7.
Welcome to It Takes a C-Tribe Village, where we learn about the environments and interactions of the unsung heroes, game changers, and innovators, and what has helped to shape and define who they are today. Now, today on the podcast, we're joined by Nic Brathwaite from Celesta Capital, someone who I've personally been fascinated with for about the last decade or so. Now, we're doing things a little bit differently this time by hosting the conversation with an intimate crowd during the C-Tribe X Tech Exec Luncheon. And the conversation is being geared around deep technology. What is it exactly? What potential does it have to disrupt an existing sector? And how does one even start to commercialize deep tech products? And what are the ways that entrepreneurs and investors can start driving real impact with their deep tech products and investments? Now, Nic's career is just really next level. And it boggles my mind just how he's been able to accomplish so much in so little time. He grew up in Grenada and he did his high school in Guyana. He then moved to Canada, where he completed both a degree in applied chemistry, where he completed a Bachelor of Commerce degree and a degree in applied chemistry. He then moved to Silicon Valley, where he got his first job at Intel. There, he earned his first patent while establishing himself as a leader in developing and implementing semiconductor assembly and packaging technology. Nic was then a co-founder of N-Chip, a startup that specialized in multi-chip modal processing technology. He helped successfully grow that company from idea to exit as it was acquired by Flextronics, now known as Flex. Now, this is where things start to get really interesting and get really serious. When Nic joined Flextronics, they were just, a measly small $200 million contract manufacturer. And of course, I say that a little bit facetiously because Nic helped grow Flextronics to be more than $30 billion in revenue and employ more than 240,000 employees in over 35 different countries worldwide. There, his team created some of the first patents for the first Xbox, Palm Pilot, and the first miniaturized cell phone charger and 50 plus other products. He could have retired, but it doesn't stop there. Nic also co-founded Riverwood Capital, which grew to be a PE fund with more than $4 billion in assets under management when he left, and included investments in companies like GoPro and Aptina. Now, just as a side note and a side quest, because that isn't enough apparently, Nic became the CEO of Aptina, and he helped grow it to be a $620 million revenue company and a leading product in the CMOS image sensory industry. Nic is now the co-founder and managing partner at Celesta Capital, a VC fund that has already deployed over $1 billion and has made more than 100 plus investments in the deep tech space. He and his wife, Nic Brathwaite, have also co-founded the Petna Foundation, a foundation that provides scholarships and funding to schools, youth, and community development organizations, and one that has helped to propel the dreams of Olympians like Anderson Peters. Now, in this podcast, we get into what the transition is like for Nic from tech student to technologist, to entrepreneur, to venture capitalist, and how Nic has been able to navigate the world of deep tech investments. And the true reason why he thinks that underserved Black and women entrepreneurs don't get the same amount of funding as maybe their counterparts, and what opportunities he saw with his investment in companies like Crocs, and what advice Nic has for the next generation, and his thesis on the Canadian ecosystem. Now, without further ado, let's get into this It Takes a C-Tribe Village with Nic Brathwaite. My name is Sar Ramzakar, and I'm your host for today.
Obviously, talking about deep tech and scaling deep tech investments, something that you have been very good at. Your record has shown that you've been very successful there. So maybe as a little foreground here to set the context for the conversation, what is deep tech?
You did a post on LinkedIn a few months ago that defined deep tech, I thought, very, very well. Actually, after I read your post, I thought, man, he's describing it much better than I could have described it. But in simple terms, we think of deep tech companies. These are companies that are leveraging, major scientific breakthroughs or major advancements in technology as their core differentiation. So you're leveraging these advanced advancements in technology and scientific breakthroughs as the basis for creating your competitive advantage. It's different from, some people think of it as more revolutionary than evolutionary. Many companies are built, and deep tech, you're actually driving you're leveraging revolutionary improvements to create new businesses.
And can you provide any concrete examples that you think the crowd could be familiar with to kind of definition that you provided there?
Well, there are lots of examples. In the semiconductor industry, for example, you mentioned Aptina and CMOS image sensors. CMOS image sensors were a major breakthrough. So before that, cameras were built based on CCD technology, and CCD technology would not have enabled things like cameras in your cell phones and those types of technologies. By the revolutionary changes that were made to allow what is the most common semiconductor technology to be able to, imaging devices, allowed us to be able to have cameras, low-cost cameras, and cameras everywhere. Without this technology, you wouldn't have cameras everywhere. Another example is things like the display. When I worked at Intel, we always had this idea that one day the computer would be something you would carry around. But back then, the display technology was very different from what you have today. And you weren't able to shrink a display to the form where you have in a cell phone. So, our idea of what a computer would look like is that it would have everything in the size of maybe what a cell phone is today. And then the displays or monitors would be passive devices that sat on desktops, and then you'll plug your computer in and you'll have a display. As a result of thin film displays, you now have displays that you can shrink, and you can now walk around with your computer, including the display, which is now a smartphone. So that's another example of scientific breakthrough and technological innovation that completely transformed not just the product but an industry. And that's the kind of things that these things could do. There are material examples and things like that. The LED lighting is another one, is another example of that. And even things like, lithium-ion battery is another example.
And so you've been doing this for quite a while, right? From technologist to entrepreneur, creating your own company, selling your own companies, and investor, and almost remixing that loop along your journey. There's probably a little bit of nuance in terms of, more than meets the eye from just reading your bio and stuff. Where did this story start, and how did you progressively get to where you are today?
Well, I'm not sure exactly where the story started. My love of science started when I was about 9 years old, and my dad bought me a physics set, and I couldn't put it down. I just kept going through every example of something you could make from that set I tried to make. And I remember back then my parents, we didn't have an alarm in our house. We didn't have a doorbell, any kind of technology like that. And at 9 years old, I put a doorbell in our house, and I was trying to set up an alarm. I never got the alarm to work, but I tried to do it. And I was one of those people who would always, every time you got a toy, an automated toy or something, I wanted to understand how it worked. But I never had intentions of being an engineer. My goal was to be a medical doctor. So when I started at McMaster, I actually started with the intention of studying medicine. After my first year, I realized I didn't like biology. And if you don't like biology, I think it's going to be hard to become a doctor. So I decided to switch. And physics was my first love. I loved physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Physics is what I really wanted to do. But I didn't know many physicists. And the few physicists I knew were teachers, people who taught me in school. And I thought, but if I studied physics, I might end up as a teacher. And I didn't want to be a teacher. So I was thinking of chemical engineering. And then McMaster had a program at that time called Applied Chemistry, which I thought was very interesting because it allowed you to go deep into chemistry and at the same time also study the application side. I was intrigued by that, by having both the deep theory, the scientific theory, and then being able to learn how to apply it. And so I did my undergrad degree at McMaster in applied chemistry and then went on to Waterloo and did material science. And just to correct a few things, I think you said that I did applied chemistry at Waterloo. I actually did material science there. And Riverwood is a private equity firm. So the first investment firm I was involved in was Riverwood, which was private equity. Celesta is venture capital. And it's important to recognize always that in everything you do, success is not based on one person. We live in a culture, especially in the United States, but in other places as well, where we like to single out an individual and build a narrative around that individual's success as though that is only that individual. And that's never the case. We're always a team, and I happen to be part of a team. And in some cases, I was the leader of the team, and in some cases, I was a member of the team. I think it's important in all of these things that, to have success, one has to know when to be the leader, and one has to know when to be a team member and be a good team member supporting the leader. So, and one last correction: at Flextronics, I was a chief technology officer. So certainly, I can't take all the claim for all of Flextronics' growth, but I do think that if you talk to people, they'll admit that and credit me with being the one that started almost all of the fastest growing businesses in Flex as we grew that company. So I am proud of that. But the thing I'm proud of most at Flex was the number of jobs we were able to create. It's one thing to build a company. When I left, we were over almost 36 billion. And that's great by itself. But when you think about all of the people that you're able to employ, almost 300,000 people, and then you think about all of the companies that had to support us, and you think about all the work you've done, and the fact that you created job opportunities for probably over 1 million people, that's the thing that I am most proud of.
That's an incredible reach and network effects. I mean, I don't know if you know, but at Riverwood Capital was actually one of the funds that invested into Sauce Labs at one point. And Sauce Labs was a company that acquired a company that I was at, Autonomic, maybe about 5 years ago. But I think that just kind of shows the depth and breadth of your reach and your team's reach and what you've been able to accomplish. On that note, in terms of a team, so when you were considering going to Flextronics and when you were considering that role of CTO, it wasn't something that you were at least immediately fond of, because Flextronics wasn't necessarily known as a technology first company, if I'm paraphrasing correctly. Could you maybe expand on that story a little bit?
Yes, that's a story that's been told a few times, sometimes from my perspective, sometimes from others. And I'm sure different people have a different point of view. But first of all, our company, Nchip, was 2 blocks from Flextronics, and I had never heard of Flextronics. And when we were introduced to Flextronics by one of our investors who had also invested in Flex, I got to learn what Flex was doing. Michael Marks, who was the CEO of Flex, and he and I have developed just a great relationship. When he was the CEO of Flex and I was the CTO, that was a relationship. In fact, Harvard Business School did a few case studies on Flex, and in several of them, they mentioned that relationship. And then we went on to start Riverwood together, and then we started Celesta together. So we've worked together for 30 years. But when we first met, I didn't know anything about Flex, and I didn't know anything about him. And they made an offer to acquire our company, and it was fine. We were a startup, and I think it was a good acquisition in that the investors did very well. And I was asked by Michael to be the chief technology officer of Flextronics. And when he first asked me to take that job, I was not happy. I was really upset. I walked, he and I were sitting at a table, I think we were having lunch, and I got up and I left and walked away and went back to the office. And he came and he said, "What was that about? I thought you'd be excited about this job." And I said, "I think it's the world's shittiest job." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Why does a company with no technology need a chief technology officer?" And he said, "Well, that's what I want to change. And I think you're the guy who can help us change that." And I said, "I'll think about it." And I was actually going to be on a flight that weekend. And he said, "Well, when you're on the plane, why don't you think about it and tell me what the job would have to be for me to take it?" And when I was on the plane, I wrote him an email outlining what I would want that job to be. And basically, I said at the time, I want to redefine the role of chief technology officer. Instead of being a guy who is developing processes and widgets in a lab that somebody else has to commercialize, I want to use technology as a way of creating new businesses inside the company. And he responded and said, "That's exactly what I had in mind." I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what he said. And then, as they say, the rest is history. We've had just a wonderful relationship. He says often that he's not a technologist and everything he knows about technology is what I know. And, he and I often would say we don't know whose ideas. People always ask us, so whose ideas was it to do this or do that or whatever. We didn't have a chief strategy officer. The chief strategy officer was he and me. And, we were the ones who started every Skunkworks project. Usually Skunkworks stuff start at the bottom and bubble up. We were the ones at the top who would start all these Skunkworks projects. And oftentimes people would say, which one of you guys had the original idea? And we can't remember because we used to talk probably 5 or 6 times a day. I used to have a cricket ball in my office. He'd come sit to my office and we'd toss the ball between each other and talk about stuff. And at the end, we would just coalesce onto an idea. And then we knew what our roles were. My role was to go execute it. And his role was to fly overhead cover and keep the enemies off of me. And in many cases, the enemies were internal.
And maybe before we get to the transition of technologist to now investor, I think you also had a story in terms of when you were graduating from Waterloo, you didn't particularly know that you wanted to go work at the company that you ended up working at. Can you maybe shed a little bit of light on that story in terms of how you ended up at Intel after university?
Yeah, I love school. And I was enjoying going to school. After I finished my undergrad degree, I went straight to Waterloo. I started at Waterloo 5 days after my final exams at Mac. So, for example, when graduation came around, I didn't even walk or anything because I was already gone. I was done. That was like a stepping stone. I was on to the next thing. And I was going to school, and as I was getting ready to defend my thesis, one of my friends asked me, what would I be doing next? And I had no idea. I hadn't thought about it, and I was kind of thinking I'll go back to the Caribbean, do something, but I didn't know what. And one of my friends asked me if I had a resume. I didn't even know what a resume was. I had never heard that word. I knew CV, but I wasn't totally dumb. I knew the term CV, but I hadn't heard the term resume. So I said, what is a resume? And she described it. And I said, well, I never worked anywhere. I don't have it. I'm not sure what I'd put on this resume. So she decided to do a resume. So she did the resume. A couple of weeks later, she came back. She asked me a bunch of questions, and then she came back and she had this resume. It was like 3/4 of a page, but double spaced. It was, there wasn't much to put on there. And she had 8 copies, and she gave me these 8 copies. And I had another friend who was there at the time, and that other friend asked me for a copy, so I didn't have anything else to do, so I gave her a copy. She ran into an Intel recruiter, and she handed Intel recruiter that copy of my resume. And I got a bunch of phone calls from this Intel guy telling me he was from Intel and he wanted to talk to me. And I didn't know why some random Intel guy was calling me, so I never returned the phone call because she didn't tell me she handed my resume to some guy from Intel. And I actually, to be honest, didn't even think that what I had done would be relevant to the semiconductor industry. I wasn't, I was doing material science. I learned later on how relevant it was. To cut a long story short, I didn't return a call, and I went to the Caribbean on vacation. I was actually in Barbados, and my cousin, I was giving her the story, and she's the one who insisted that I should call the Intel people. Of course, I didn't have the number at that time, but Intel had a facility in Barbados, so I called that facility, and I spoke to somebody in HR. They asked me to come in. I was actually at the airport about to catch a flight to Grenada, so my cousin insisted I should take a later flight, and she drove me to Intel. And I went there, and the guy there made a phone call to Santa Clara, found out the recruiter, all this stuff, and then next thing I know, some guy was flying down to Barbados to meet with me to talk to me about this job. Now, I want to make it clear, I don't think that had anything to do with my qualifications or anything like that. I am pretty sure if I was in Des Moines, Iowa or something, he wasn't coming. But I think coming to Barbados probably was the attraction. I just happened to be the excuse. I eventually got hired by Intel. So the one thing I could say coming out of that story is don't do what I did, because I did everything wrong. And I honestly believe that God had in mind for that to be where my career started, because there is no possible reason I should have gotten that job based on all of the things I just described.
You had some really persistent people in your network for you. Now, the onset of becoming an investor, I think I understand it as you initially started just angel investing with a few friends, and obviously that has led to kind of some of the roles that you have now, starting your own PE fund, your own VC fund. But yeah, walk us through that. What was the onset of that, and what made you keen to continue to grow in that space of becoming an investor?
I had no interest in investing, none at all, of being a venture capital investor, an angel investor, whatever at all. When I was at Flex, I also had responsibility for some of the investments that we made, and some of them were pretty successful. There was one company called Infi, which we led Infi Series C as a startup. It was an investment that I saw what they were doing, new area in semiconductors. I suggested to Michael, our CEO, that we should invest in this company. He didn't know much about it, but he trusted me and allowed us to invest. It was a very good investment. That was about the limit of my interest, that kind of things, investing on behalf of the company. As a personal investor, I never really had that much of an interest. And the first real investment I was involved in was Crocs. And again, I wasn't looking to be an investor. That opportunity came when one of the guys that worked with us, a guy called Ron Snyder, he worked with us at Flex. He left and he came back some months later. We were just talking about what he was up to, and he told us about this little shoe company he was consulting with. As I recall, and I could be wrong about this, but as I recall, their revenue really small, like not even $1 million, as I recall. And he was telling us about this company and all of this, and he said, we started asking questions like, what's the plan? What are you guys doing? And it was a real cruisy type of thing. Like, they had this process that they had developed for making the shoe, but they were buying the materials from some company, and then they were using another company to manufacture the shoe. And, we were a manufacturing company. We thought manufacturing all day long. So we looked at it and said, this doesn't make any sense. Why don't you do this? And we started giving advice. And this is over lunch. And next thing you know, Michael said, why don't we invest in this company and help you? And so he came around and said, what do you guys think? So we all decided, let's go invest in it and help them. And so collectively, there were 6 of us, I believe. And together we put up about $5 million. And, some of the guys that worked for me went and helped them set up the processes. In fact, Ron ended up hiring a bunch of my guys from the engineering group at Flex to help him out, and some other people in supply chain. And then this thing just took off. I had no expectation that this would be this big. In fact, when I first showed my wife the shoe, a design, it wasn't even a shoe, a design of what the shoe was going to look like, she told me that nobody is going to buy this shoe. And I thought to myself, I just blew a bunch of money. I felt really badly. So I went to Michael and I said, Michael, man, I feel badly. My wife thinks this is a really bad investment. I think I want to cut back my contribution in half. So Michael said, well, okay, if you want to do that, we already committed. So I guess I'll have to make it up. And another one of the 6 of us did the same thing. So Michael had to make that up too. And he sometimes says that was the best decision we ever made for him, because 4 years later, that $5 million was worth $500 million. And so it's 100 times return in 4 years. And that started to get me more interested in this whole investing thing. I did not know then that this was a once in a lifetime type of return. And I already had my once in a lifetime, so it was downhill from there on. So that's how I got started in this. And when Michael left Flextronics, he was hired by KKR. He didn't leave because he was hired, but he left, he retired, and then KKR recruited him to become their first, he was the first outside partner ever hired by KKR, and they hired him to head up their tech practice. And he told them that he would like me to come and join him. And I spoke with several people there, and I think they all were interested in me joining, but I decided that was not the right thing for me, because at the time they were primarily, more of a leverage buyout type company at the time. They're much different now, and I just, as I told Michael, I said, I'm a real engineer, not a financial engineer, and I didn't think that was a good fit. And about a year later, Michael came and he said, man, why don't we just start our own investment firm? And that is how Riverwood Capital came. When I said yes, I was still at Flex, but I had given Flex notice that I was retiring, because I had this goal of retiring in my 40s, and I told Flex in February, that was 2007, I think. In February, I would retire, and they were ignoring me. It took me 11 months to get out of Flex, just because the CEO then didn't think I was serious, and a bunch of different things. But anyway, I ended up being retired for 2 months, and then we started Riverwood Capital. And but it was 6 of us. Initially, it started with Michael and me working through this, and then a few other people came in, and there was six of us that started Riverwood Capital, and it was the worst possible time to start an investment firm. It was in 2008. Our first meetings were in August of 2008. They were great meetings, and then the market crashed. And the people we had the great meetings with weren't even returning our phone calls. And so it took us about 2 years eventually to raise the fund. But we had this great deal in our back pocket, which was Aptino, which was spinning out this business from Micron, and helped us to raise the fund because this was a spin-out, a $700 million spin-out from a publicly traded company, and nobody knew about it. It was truly a proprietary deal. Everybody says they have proprietary deals. This was truly proprietary, and this was an area we knew very well, because I had started the camera module business of Flextronics, which at one time was the biggest supplier of embedded cameras in the world. And so we were able to do that deal. That was our first investment. And that fund ended up doing extremely well.
And now I think you all are about $4 billion assets under management with Riverwood.
Yeah, well, I'm no longer with Riverwood, but when I
correct.
left, Riverwood was $4 billion. I think now they're closer to probably $7 or $8 billion now.
Gotcha. So you've led and scaled, incredible products and incredible teams. I believe also GoPro was a company that was part of that portfolio at was it Riverwood?
At Riverwood. That first fund,
Yep.
GoPro, Aptina, Ambarella.
So
Some of you might know Globant. Those were all some very, very good investments.
very good wins. What are some of the best lessons that you've taken away when it comes to building and leading world-class teams? And maybe as some context too, I mean, I think GoPro is a brand that everybody knows today, but back when y'all made the investment, it maybe wasn't as big as a company. How did that opportunity come about, and what was your role in maybe supporting that team, given that you had a lot of background in some of the engineering work that they were doing?
But I'll start with the GoPro question first, and then we can follow up on the other. GoPro was, nobody knew about GoPro really. GoPro was started by Nick Woodman, who is a very, very good entrepreneur. He was a surfer, maybe still is a surfer, who wanted to develop a product that he and his friends could film each other while they were surfing. And one person asked me one time, how would I define GoPro? And I said, GoPro is a company that developed a wearable camera so that people could film themselves doing crazy, stupid things and then share it with their friends. And so Nick started this company with a $35,000 loan from his mother. And he was building it up, and it started to get some traction. But he was selling to small outlets like REI and some of these other small outlets. And he was starting to think that he needed some advice around scaling a business and manufacturing and things like that. So he asked his stepfather, who happens to be a very famous venture capitalist also, who, by the way, did not invest with him at that time. And his stepfather suggested that he should talk to Michael Marks. And Michael Marks was my partner and co-founder. So he went and he met with Michael. And then Michael told him, the guy you really need to talk to is Nic Brathwaite. So then Michael introduced him to me. And while we were sitting in my office, and he's telling me about all his problems, and his biggest problems at the time were that he was so small and insignificant that nobody was paying any attention to him, and so he had real supply chain problems. And 2 of his most important product devices that he needed, and 2 of his biggest problems had to do with the image processor, the sensor, and the sensor and then the process. And the sensor was coming from Aptina, where I was chairman and CEO. So as he said that, I just picked up the phone and I said, hold on a second, I can solve that problem for you right now. And I picked up the phone and I talked to the folks at Aptina and said, you need to help this guy out. You need some chips. There's not that many. And then I called the CEO. Then the other one was a processor and Ambarella. And Ambarella was one of our portfolio companies. And so I knew the CEO very well. So I called the CEO and I told him, help him out. He didn't really believe in what GoPro was doing, but he said, okay. And so then Nick, all of a sudden he had more problems and more stuff you want to talk about. So Michael and I said to him, hey man, we're not consultants. If you want our help, you're going to have to let us invest in it, and then we can help you. And he said, well, I don't really need the money. And he said, well, you need the advice. And to get the advice, you have to take the money. So eventually Nick decided, okay. So we signed up to put $80 million into the... Michael and I. And then when we presented it to our co-founders, they didn't like the deal at all. They didn't like the company. In fact, initially, I didn't like the terms either. We had signed up for a higher pre-money valuation. And I remember after Michael and I talked about it, I went home and I couldn't sleep that night. I thought it was too high. So next day I went back and I said, Michael, I think this is too high. He said, yeah, man, I couldn't sleep either. So he changed it to a lower number, which Nic accepted. But then our partners still didn't like that. So after some heated discussions, they eventually said, okay, we'll allow you guys to invest half the amount, 40 million. But we had already signed up for 80. So we then had to go around and find the other 40. And that's when we went and talked to all the other investors and brought the other 40 million in. So, and then GoPro ended up being like a 15x return. And we teased the other guys and tell them that every other investor that benefited from GoPro benefited because our partners didn't allow us to put all the money in. So, but when we invested in GoPro, shortly around that time, they got this deal from Best Buy to start rolling out the product in Best Buy. But Best Buy wanted a real camera. GoPro at the time was using a reference design that Ambarella, who was a processing company, made as a way of showing people what their chip is capable of doing. It wasn't a real product, really, as we product guys would call it. But Nic would take that product, put GoPro on it, and basically sell it. And so Nic came to me and he said, man, I'm going to need to hire a head of engineering, because he had one engineer in the company at the time and was a guy designing accessories. And Nic had a person in mind and he asked me to talk to that person. I spoke to that person and I told him I don't think that was the right person. He asked me if I could give him 4 or 5 names that he could. And I said, because if I have 4 or 5 names, I can tell you which one is the best. How would you determine which one is the best? Why don't I just tell you which one is the best and you just hire that person? But if you don't like that person, tell me why you don't like them and I'll give you another name. And Nic said, okay. And the first name I gave him was a guy called Fabrice Barbier that used to work for me. Nic liked him, but he didn't think we could hire him because he had a big fancy job and he didn't know anything with GoPro. So I was the one who actually negotiated Fabrice's package and got Fabrice hired for Nic, and then helped build the engineering team for GoPro. But as we were building the team, because Nic was never a product guy in the beginning, he knew what he wanted. And like I said, he's a phenomenal entrepreneur. But the idea of having a PRD and MRD and product definition and that, they didn't have any of that stuff. So the first product definition for GoPro was done this way. In our conference room at Riverwood, I called Nic and brought Nic in and all the engineers. We didn't have many engineers at the time, just a few. And I said, okay, Nic, you have everything in your head. We got to get it from your head into a document that the engineers could use to develop the first product. And while Nic is telling me what he has in mind, I'm writing it on the whiteboard. And at the end, I took a picture of the whiteboard, handed it to the engineers and said, here's your product definition. Let's go develop the product. And we had to develop the product. We had 8 months. Best Buy wanted to launch in October. This was in February. And we had to build a team and do all of that. And so I told Nic I would be the interface for him on this. And we were able to do it. So we pulled it off and we got the first product launched and the company took off. We also looking to get manufacturers. The big name manufacturers wanted nothing to do with this product because those of you who might remember, there was a company called Pure Digital who had a video product, did well for a while. Then Cisco acquired them and then it flopped. And everybody thought GoPro was going to end up like that. And I convinced one of the big manufacturers in Taiwan who owed me some favors to do the manufacturing for GoPro. And he didn't want to do it either, by the way. But he did owe me some favors, and I reminded him, and I said, this is a favor, this is what I want in return for the favors. And he did it, and it turned out to be a big success. So GoPro went from, when we made the investment, I think it was around 40 million in revenue that year, and then the next year we did 250, then 500, then $1 billion. Then we went public, and it was worth like 10 billion, and today it's worth a lot less.
So there's the PayPal mafia, and then I think there's also the Nic Brathwaite mafia here. We're starting to circle around on. I think we can go on and on in terms of the unique stories that you have about the different investments that you've made. I wish we can touch a little bit on Tesla too, but maybe that can be for a round 3. There is one company that I do want to talk about. You did share a video about a couple months with me. It's a company called, I think, Onyx Homes. So we're going to maybe foray into that a little bit. Then we're going to talk specifically about opportunities into deep technology that you're seeing right now. But yeah, let's start with Onyx Homes here, because I'm particularly fascinated in this one because your team has found a way to, almost reimagine the end-to-end process of building and manufacturing homes and neighborhoods and whole communities and stuff. I probably butchered the pitch a little bit there, but yeah, can you maybe shed a little bit of light on Onyx Homes and some of the work that y'all are doing, and maybe where the lens of, hard technology or deep tech comes now that you're kind of more in the, let's just say, home builder space, for lack of a better words?
Yeah, well, one of the areas that we like investing in is in businesses that are transforming large existing industry. And it is our thesis that there are many large existing industries, construction being one of them, agriculture is another one, financial services, and many of these, where these industries, either due to lack of productivity improvement or lack of innovation or both, are underserving the needs of today's global marketplace. And we believe that technology can be leveraged to transform these industries to make them more relevant in today's global environment. And, we took on Onyx Homes because we saw if you look at the construction industry, over the last 50, 60 years or more, the construction industry has continued to decline in productivity at a very dramatic rate. If you take in the US, if you take all of the industries combined, productivity has improved by 150, maybe even 200%. In the industry we come from, the semiconductor industry, we double productivity every 18 months, at least at that time, in the early days. So we thought that technology can be leveraged to change that, to turn that around. And so we started by analyzing the major issues that are involved in construction and trying to figure out how technology could be applied to solve some of those problems. So there are many problems, but I'll just point out a few. If productivity is continuing to decrease, that's a fact. If some of you could check this, and I know everybody has their phones and the internet these days, so I believe the Empire State Building was built in about 14 months. And you try to build something like that today in 14 months, it's impossible. You can't do it. When we were at Flextronics, we built a factory in 72 days. And so we've had some experience on how you can potentially do things differently and accomplish, pretty dramatic results. But again, we went back and looked at what are the issues, what are some of the issues. So productivity is an issue. There are many causes of productivity. One is weather. Is an issue that affect productivity. Another issue that affects productivity is just these workflows and the way people go about doing these things. It's just not optimized. And so we thought you can leverage advanced manufacturing into home building. Now, this is very different from when people talk about modular buildings and stuff like that, because many companies take a slightly different approach. It may look like the same, but it's not the same. If you just take a process and you move it indoor, you can save the issues associated with weather because you're indoor. But if your processes are the same, you're actually not changing many of the other factors that are impacting productivity. But there are also some other issues. The construction industry pretty much employs only men. Very few women are employed in the construction industry. So 50% of the population are not involved in a meaningful way in this industry. And one of the reasons you hear is that, women can't lift heavy stuff and, all of the safety things and other issues associated with that. So again, if you could automate these processes, on the other hand, you go to the electronics industry and you see mostly women who are running a lot of those manufacturing processes. And so if you can automate, now you can employ from throughout. So some of the issues you have with shortage of labor and high cost of labor and other issues, you could potentially address. So the idea was, how do you take advanced manufacturing and apply it to construction and think of this as a technology company, an advanced manufacturing company whose products happen to be building, instead of thinking about it as a construction company. And that was the approach. And we started looking at how do you automate things. We looked at the entire manufacturing flow and how do you automate it. And the idea was started by three of us. We're good friends. We talk all the time, but a lot of the deep conversations happened over a couple lunches. And it was Michael Marks, Ash Bhardwaj, and myself. We all worked at Flex. We all knew each other well. We'd all built Flex into a very big manufacturing company. We knew what we were doing, and we decided to go do this. And then the challenge was, how do you convince the builders, the developers, to do what we thought was the right thing to do? So we decided, let's just become developers too. So we don't have to convince anybody. So we bought land and started building, and that was 3 years ago. And now, we've so far built and delivered 500 homes, and these homes are being lauded for, being among some of for the price point, some of the highest quality, highest efficiency homes. We started in Florida because we only start in a tough environment where you have to deal with things like hurricanes and floods and a bunch of these things, because we figured if we did it somewhere else, people might say, well, it works there, but can it work in Florida and California? And you'd always have these skeptics. So we went to one of the toughest areas, and now we have 5 developments being built in Florida, and we just started one in Texas. And we're very, very pleased with the way this is going. And all of the thesis behind this is playing out almost exactly as we thought it was, but we think we could even be better. So we're building a 2,000 square foot home today in 35 days.
Oh my gosh. I think that's why the lights were flickering.
And that's concrete, by the way. That's a concrete home.
This is dropping bombs in here. That's why the lights were flickering. So maybe shifting to gears a little bit here to, you've made some conscious efforts to grow your presence in Canada. I mean, obviously you've done your school here, but you did migrate down south, and you have been living and building brands and businesses and companies in the U.S. for, I think, the last 25 years. But I think there's a little bit of interest of maybe finding avenues to explore the Canadian market in a little bit of a deeper fashion. Can you maybe expand on what has instigated that, and what avenues you have already currently explored, i.e. at McMaster, and other avenues that you're looking to explore?
Yeah, this started as a result of the president of McMaster and I are friends, and they would come to the Silicon Valley on a regular basis, and they would ask me for help introducing them to various people. And over the years, I've made several introductions, but nothing much seemed to happen. So a couple of years ago, they were coming and they asked me again to make introductions, which I did, but I decided I'm going to actually sit in on the meeting to understand why nothing much was happening. So I sat in on the meetings, and what struck me, I sat on 2 meetings. There were 2 things that were obvious to me. One was that here we have McMaster University, not just one of the top universities in Canada, but one of the top universities in the world, and they're in a room trying to convince investors to pay attention to Canada, because we have these great universities that are doing phenomenal research, and we have all this talent and all of this stuff, and they were hardly getting much attention. People would be nice and pleasant and all of this stuff. And afterwards, I met with the president, and I said, we're going about this the wrong way, because here I am sitting in this room, and you're trying to convince investors to pay more attention to Canada, and I'm an investor, and you don't have to convince me, but you're asking me to introduce you to people that you need to try to convince. Why don't you and I just go work on this together? So he liked the idea. And the thing about Canada is just a phenomenal place in a number of ways, but as it relates to deep tech, Canada has some of the top research institutions in the world, and we produce great talent. And the United States and others, but in particular the United States, use us as a source for recruiting talent. So I'm an example of that. I was Canadian educated talent that ended up in Silicon Valley, recruited, and there are lots of people like me coming out of all of the universities in Canada. And then what often happens is you get some great startups get founded in Canada, and soon after they get founded, you have VCs come in from the US and move them to the US, move them out of Canada and move them to the US. So as a result of that, Canada is not getting as much economic value from all of this deep technical research that's going on and from the technical talent that's being developed. Yes, companies like Google and so come in and they set up engineering centers here, and almost every company that I've been involved with, either as an operator or as a board member, has had engineering centers here. At Flextronics, we had almost 1,000 engineers in Canada, including in Calgary. So we took advantage of that too. But if you look at the leading industries in Canada, I would argue that over the last 20 years or more, our relative performance in terms of leading industry performance has declined. My theory is that part of that is because the deep tech startup ecosystem in Canada is not as vibrant as it can be. And so I decided to work with McMaster and with some folks in the government and others to try to see if we can help to turn that around. And the idea here is to bring in investors like us, deep tech investors like us, to help Canadian universities figure out how to optimize their research for commercialization so that you have a higher chance of something going from research to commercialization, and that the process for that is relatively frictionless. And that requires, working with the universities and with the researchers and with their accelerators and all the things they're doing to try to get better results, and also working with the government to see if there are things that we can do to try to help make it easier to attract venture capital money to come in here. Because deep tech, there are not a lot of people investing. And even in Canada is even less. And then in Canada, the appetite for deep tech investment is not as big. Even the people investing in deep tech, many of the investors, not all of them, I don't want this to come across as generalizing everyone. Deep tech investing requires conviction. And it requires also deep technical understanding of the technologies and the competitive landscape and all of these things. So you can't be a generalist investor and make it be a successful deep tech investor. You could do it by following the deep tech investors, finding a good partner and following them. We think that the deep tech investment firms have to be built from the ground up to be deep tech investment firms, and they require a lot of technical expertise and also operating expertise. Deep tech is very difficult to invest in deep tech if your plan is to try to flip something, because the development cycles are so long. Like, what do you flip? It takes a long time before you have something that you can actually sell or take public or whatever. So based on the dynamics here, we think that there is a great opportunity for us, Celesta, but also for our investment partners and others, to look at Canada in the same way as you see a lot of investors looking at India today, and before that was looking at Israel. What's the difference between, look at how successful deep tech investments have been in Israel. Why can't we have the same results here in Canada? And so the objective here is to try to work with all of the stakeholders that we can to try to create a much more vibrant deep tech startup ecosystem.
Pulling on that thread of some of the challenges that one has to overcome when building, a deep technology, driven product. You kind of aligned on, there isn't something that you can just invest in for 1 or 2 years and look to flip it and stuff. But can you maybe talk about what upside you see in terms of investing in deep tech? I think the last time that we were chatting, you mentioned that, there is less that could be spent on the actual go-to-market, given the technological moat that is created, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, what is some of the upside that your firm has seen from investing in deep technology companies?
Well, you could look at our performance. Our very first fund, which was a 2013 vintage fund, we invested in 19 companies, and that fund has so far returned almost 5x gross returns. And there are not a lot of funds that have that kind of performance. And we believe that, and I have to be careful why I say these things, because we're in the process of raising a fund, and I don't want to come across as advertising in any way, but we believe with the right deep tech investment, venture capital firms could be in the top decile or certainly the top quartile in terms of performance within the VC space. But again, you have to know what you're doing there. The point I made was there is a perception that deep tech investing is more capital intensive than software, for example, and other forms of other technology investments. And that is to some extent true, but it's not universally true. The time it takes to develop the product and the amount it takes to develop the product is different. So in the product development stage, deep tech costs more and takes longer. If you look at many enterprise software and other companies, they spend a lot of money on customer acquisition. And so when you look at total costs, including the product development and the building of the businesses, it is not necessarily less capital intensive than a deep tech investment. But the deep tech investment, the money is, a lot of capital is upfront. And that in itself is a challenge. So I don't want to minimize that. So if you look at return plots, there is no doubt that the time it takes, for example, to maybe return the initial investment is often much shorter in non-deep tech than in deep tech investment. But then what generally could be a lot different than what we see is that after that hockey stick tends to be much more pronounced with the deep tech investments that we're seeing. So an example of that is, in a deep tech company like ours, you can take 6 years maybe to return the full capital of the fund. I'm talking about a fund, not of an individual company. Whereas in a non-deep tech, it might take 3 or 4 years. But then when you look at the next 4 years, 3 or 4 years after that, in deep tech, oftentimes you see a much faster hockey stick effect.
And why is that? You think?
Because I think in many cases the value of what you're creating is greater. So once you get to the point that you have a product, then you see that effect much greater because of the at least the perceived value to the industry.
And why don't deep tech companies maybe spend as much on the customer acquisition?
There are multiple reasons, and I don't want to trivialize this because it's hard to just answer that in one. I think what happens in deep tech is oftentimes the product, again, because if you're leveraging scientific breakthroughs and technological advancements, the perceived value the product is there, and the differentiation is also there. In many of these deep tech companies, when they launch a product, if you get the right company, there's nothing else close to. Competition always comes, but I think that is one. So I don't think you need necessarily to spend as much on the customer acquisition stuff as you did. Now, some people would also say in some cases their unit costs are a lot higher depending on what the deep tech is. Yeah, so that's also true. You have some deep tech companies where you're selling a product for $50,000. That's not the case in like the software business necessarily. So there are multiple reasons. But a big factor, I believe, is the perceived value to the industry and the differentiation from the competition, if you get it right.
So the last question I have, and I don't know if you remember this one from last time, but what is something that you would ask yourself if you were to unearth something about yourself that maybe people in this room already don't know?
I remember you asked it. I don't even remember what my answer was then either, but...
I can remind you.
Yeah, remember what was the answer?
I think you also have a belief that there's a misconception of being, a quote unquote black entrepreneur or black investor, and you don't necessarily look at the shortcomings of that maybe the same way as others would look at it. You have a fundamental belief that if you are really good at what you do and what your North Star, that you will align with the right folks that will either be investors or partners or mentors or advisors and stuff. So you try to, and it's not to say that you are totally naive of maybe challenges that black entrepreneurs face, but you don't think there's maybe bigger problems like maybe women founders who get less investment from a comparison scale in terms of how many female entrepreneurs there are versus, let's say, black entrepreneurs. So I did a terrible job of paraphrasing it, but hopefully that was a fair reminder.
Yeah, I remember that conversation. I thought it was a slightly different question, but let me elaborate on that a little bit. So there is no doubt that there are biases that exist in the world, and there are challenges that some of us have to face because of different things. I think that we have to be careful about always jumping on the race or your gender or whatever as being the reason why you're not having success. Because I've seen that. I've seen a lot of pitch decks that are just not very good. And then I meet the founders and they tell me, well, the reason I'm not getting any attention in Silicon Valley is because I don't look like the investors. And I go, well, you look like you invest in your stuff either. So I think we have to be very careful of that. But again, I want to make it clear that, there are biases and stuff. But I think the issue is a little bit different. And again, this is just my thesis. I think the issue is really not about the pitch deck, and it's not about the founder so much in terms of who is the founder of this company. I think it has more to do with the fact that because a lot of minorities, and I'll talk about black people first, a lot of black people do not get the opportunities necessarily to move up in many companies. When you see a founder a black founder, they have less executive maturity. If you try to analyze the business based on the experience or executive maturity of that founder, they will always be rated lower. But I think investors need to take the time to really hear the people, learn more about them. Because I think you'll realize that oftentimes they're really very good and they have the potential to build really very great businesses. But they're starting from a lower place because they never had the opportunity to be in that higher place. It's not that they're not good enough. They never had the opportunity. So I think when you hear people say, well, we not just bet on the company and the technology, but we also bet on the person. A lot of time that bet has to do with previous experience and those things. But an African American founder is not likely to have that level of experience because in many cases they don't get the opportunities to get there. So you sometimes have to try to overcome that criteria and dig a little bit deeper. So I think there are two things that we have to improve. First of all, those of us who are black have to not always play the race card. And everything is not always race. In fact, many times they don't even know who the founder was when you see a 2-page summary of a business. So, and most investors, if you could make them a whole lot of money, even if they may have some biases, they'll back you if you think they could make you a bunch of money. So I think there are other issues, and again, there's biases and biases. The point I made, however, is while there may be racial biases, women make up 50% of the population. And, something like 1 or 2% of VC money go into women-founded companies. So if you look at just the mathematics, blacks might make up 10 or 12%, women make up 50%, and they get the same amount of money in the companies founded by them. And so that is also an atrocity, in my opinion. And again, in many cases for the same reason. A lot of women don't get the opportunity to get into that C-suite or that higher level of management as early as others. And so when they come up with an idea, something, if you just look at their backgrounds, you look at their experience, and they may not have the same level of experience and executive maturity as somebody else. But that doesn't mean to say they can't be just as good. I think as you see pitches coming from minorities, underrepresented minorities, we ought to not value experience as much just because they never had the opportunity. But you're going to have to dig deeper and understand the potential of these people to be great.
Well, let's give a round of applause to Nic. And so I will roam around with this mic in case there are any audience questions. I mean, I can go for hours myself, but maybe we'll open up the floor in case anyone has any questions.
I just wanted to ask, how did you get from being a student, going into Intel as an employee, and then kind of where was the specific point you pivoted into entrepreneurship and being an owner? Is it like when you had patents in Intel, kind of that ownership kind of idea, or how did you pivot from that employee-student situation into an entrepreneur? Thank you.
Well, when I joined Intel, I was hired with a bunch of other engineers as a new college graduate, and I started my career actually as a process engineer in manufacturing. And after about a year and a half or so, I was promoted to be engineering manager. I had no knowledge. I didn't know what a manager really was supposed to do. I had to learn. But in the tech world, you tend to get promoted based on your performance as an engineer, and then you all of a sudden thrusted into this position of management. I didn't have a goal or an objective to be an entrepreneur. In fact, I would say I was initially a reluctant entrepreneur. I was contacted by some guys who later on became very good friends, but I didn't know them initially, who were looking to start a company which was spinning out technology from Lawrence Livermore National Labs. And they were looking for somebody that had a similar background to mine, which had to do with miniaturization approaches. And I had a number of publications, and I had a few I think I maybe had 1 or 2 patents in that space at that time. And when they first approached me, I was not interested. I actually said no, because I was doing okay at Intel. I was still a young guy, and I was having a good time. And they kept talking to me and about leaving Intel and joining them in this entrepreneurial venture. And eventually I said yes, but it took a lot. I remember I called my dad, and I asked him what he thought. And I was expecting my dad to say, no, don't do that. My dad is a conservative Caribbean guy, And, he came from that background where, especially as a person of color, you focus on security. And when my dad said to me, I think you should do it, my first reaction was, I must have dialed the wrong number. And then I asked him why, and he said, because you're young, and if it doesn't work out, it's not going to have a big impact on you. I wasn't married, I didn't have children, I didn't even own a house, and I didn't have that much money in the bank that if I lost it, it would be a big deal. And then everybody I asked kept telling me I should do this, and that's how I eventually decided to join these guys in starting of Venture. And then once I did it, then I was sold on this whole idea of entrepreneurship. And so even in Flex, I was more of an entrepreneur than, the typical CTO, because I was starting and running businesses. So I wasn't just a guy managing engineering organizations. When I left Flex, I had 3 business unit presidents that reported to me. So I was actually building and running businesses in addition to developing technologies and products.
Hello, Nick.
Hi.
Thanks for taking the time to join us. I had a question about evolution and revolution and what the difference between, or maybe the gap between those two concepts looked like 20 or 30 years ago, and what maybe it looks like today. Probably more importantly, what it will look like in 10 or 20 years with things like AI around, things like, blockchain around, rules and regulations, regulatory landscapes changing. Is that shrinking? Is it going to be easier to revolutionize things? Is it going to be more difficult to revolutionize things? Are things that we maybe considered evolutionary in yesteryears going to be considered revolutionary? Those jumps going to be considered revolutionary?
It's a very difficult question for me to answer, but I'll give it my best shot. But first of all, it's very difficult to predict anything 10 years or 20 years from today, especially in the technology world. I was in a board meeting not too long ago where people were talking about interest rates and interest rates staying higher for longer. And I asked, how long is that? And they said, it could be 10 years. And I said, in the industry I come from, 10 years is not longer, 10 years is forever. And so, we're working in an industry where things move fast and the rate of technology continues to accelerate over time. So if the rate of technology development or technology improvements is accelerating, it's accelerating a lot of time primarily because of I believe primarily because of evolutionary type changes. But every now and then you get something that creates a discontinuous disruption in that path that we're following. And AI represents one of those. But AI is not the first. AI might be the biggest. The semiconductors represented that, and the internet represented that, and there's other things that you had that represent that. But AI certainly has the potential to be the biggest disruptor that we have ever seen so far. And one would argue that if the rate of technology is accelerating over time, we will continue to get some of these big disruptors, and the impact of these disruptors are probably likely to be bigger as we go along. So 20 years from today, I don't know what that would be, but if you had asked somebody 20 years ago, they wouldn't have thought of maybe AI either. Although AI certainly is not new. Many people started learning about AI when ChatGPT was launched, but those of us who are investors had to invest in those companies before that happened. So we were investing in AI for the past, I think, 7 years or so. We've already sold AI companies. So these opportunities come up, and you make those investments, and every now and then you get opportunities like this that are huge and have huge potential. Now, does this have the potential to even further accelerate the pace of development? Sure. Because if you think about what AI is doing, over the years we have continued to generate and collect more and more data. And now we have so much data that we have more data than the human mind can process and leverage. And now we have AI that can come in and help augment human intelligence to allow us to do things we couldn't do before. So of course that would help us to accelerate the pace at which we can do things and the pace at which we can make progress. But of course that comes with downside risks and issues, like every technology. The internet was a great technology that has brought great benefits. Bad actors find a way to use great ideas for their own purposes as well. And so we're going to have that with AI. And so we have to be careful about ensuring two aspects. One is how do we protect biases? Because despite the fact that AI is primarily, machine learning and AI and stuff, there's a heavy equipment component to this. There are humans in the loop. And there are humans in the loop at the start of the loop, the start, where you have the people who are programming and stuff and making sure we look at their biases. And then you have humans at the end who are getting data and information and making decisions on them without understanding, how the relevance or the accuracy of the recommendations they may be getting. So we have to work on solving these problems, just like we have to with other things. But AI certainly represents one of the biggest of such challenges that we've seen so far.
One statement. I know you mentioned earlier that you weren't a financial engineer, but you just picked up on interest rate movements. And it seems you're in those meetings.
But I am an investor, so I do have to pay attention to financial stuff. But I remember at university at McMaster, I decided to take some classes in economics, and so because I just felt it might be a good idea. So for my electives, I would take economics and philosophy. Every year I would take economics and philosophy, and I didn't know that so many years later it would come back to be a little bit useful.
Yeah, let's give another round of applause for Nic. So yeah, that's it for our formal programming today. Nic, really humbled and happy that you were willing and able to return back to Calgary and help us almost do a 2.0 of this session. Obviously, we covered a lot of material that we covered the first time, but I think we also introduced some new things into the equation. And yeah, hopefully we will see you around in Calgary a little bit more.